Latinos are actually very responsible for the addition of new jobs in the American economy. However, access to capital to this group is extremely limited. We want to help change that. We want to make a difference both with our capital and make the private equity community aware of all that we have to offer and all of the opportunity that they're passing up on.
Our mission is to find, fund, and grow the most promising Latinx and Hispanic ventures. We want to make sure that Angeles Investors is a platform in where these companies not only do well from the business perspective, but also they shine. So we are very involved in building the next generation of Latinx and Hispanics entrepreneurs.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Angeles Investors Charla series. We're excited to get 2022 kicked off with a charla on startup boards and governance, which will be hosted by Bernadette Aulestia and will feature our esteemed panelist. As you heard in the video, we at Angeles Investors, we're on a mission to find, fund, and grow the most promising Hispanic and Latinx ventures. And our charla series is really an extension of that mission. Here we host monthly discussions featuring top experts in startups and investments, focus on topics, top trending topics that are of interest to our community of accredited investors and to you all here that are listening with us today. So please feel free to watch some of our previous episodes of the Charla series on our Angeles Investors YouTube channel. As we look at the agenda for today, at 5:45, we're going to have a Q&A session. So please feel free to drop in any questions that you may have in the chat throughout our charla. And at 5:45, our panelists will have an opportunity to answer a few of those questions for you. Now, before we begin our charla, we're not able to do any of these without our sponsors. And here we're going to feature our headline sponsor, BMO Bank, which is being represented by Leticia Flores Pool. Leticia, the floor is yours.
Good evening, buenas noches, everyone. Yes, thank you. My name is Leticia Flores Pool. I am one of the heads for our BMO for Black and Latinx Small Business Program, which is an access to capital program. Very happy and proud to be here tonight. On behalf of BMO Harris Bank, we are extremely proud to have Angeles Investors as one of our key partners in our communities and aligning our missions to help our Latino founders. So again, welcome tonight. Looking forward to a great charla conversation. And I will turn it over to Bernadette to get us started.
Excellent. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Angeles Investor Charla on startup boards and governance. My name is Bernadette Aulestia. I am a former media executive. I'm an investor. I'm a current board member on both private and public companies. And today, this is going to be, I'm really delighted. It's going to be a super fun conversation, hopefully very fast paced. So please definitely make sure to get your questions in. So high growth startups, all the rage, unicorns, high valuations, hyper growth, right? All part of the lexicon. And tonight, I am so happy to have my dear friends and colleagues, Rodrigo Garcia, Rachel Tenbrink, and Lister Delgado, who are going to join me to talk a little bit about their experience, their journey as advisors and board directors to startups. So we're going to get started with a quick round of introductions. If you can all tell us a little bit about your professional background. We want to know about your personal background. I'm Ecuatoriana, by the way. And if you can also tell us a little bit about your current boards that you're on. So why don't we start with Rachel to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here. So I'm Rachel Tenbrink. I'm a Costa Rican with Cuban parents, so I'm a tica. So my professional background has always been in consumer and consumer tech. I spent 15 years building billion-dollar brands at Estee Lauder and L'Oreal. And then in 2014, I was a co-founder of a company called Scentbird that was backed by Y Combinator. Company's still doing well and huge, but relatively recently, I moved to the investing side. So now I'm the general partner and co-founder of a fund called Red Bike Capital. In addition, I currently sit on 2 boards, one non-for-profit board. So I sit on Diaper, which is a diaper subscription, and Above Board, which is a SaaS platform for recruiting diverse executive talent, also an Angeles investment. And I also sit on Code Inspire, which is a non-for-profit that helps bring coding education to diverse children at early education level. So that's a little bit.
Great. Thank you. Lister, do you want to tell us about your background?
Sure. Would love to. I am an immigrant. I was born in Peru. I came to the U.S. when I was 17 years old. One half of my family is Peruvian. The other side is Cuban. And I was an engineer for the first 5 years of my professional career and turned to the dark side, I guess, of venture investing. And I've been doing this for almost 20 years. I cannot believe. I was noticing how old I look compared to my picture. I think one of those pictures that you have up there is from one of my early days. So I run a venture capital firm called Idea Fund Partners. We are based in North Carolina, and we invest in the future of homes and housing and the future of enterprise and working. And I am on 6 boards currently of tech companies, 2 boards as observers, so 8 in total. And I'm on a board member also of a not-for-profit called El Futuro. I'm most proud of that one because it really touches my heart. It's an entity that is focused on providing mental health services for Latinos and bilingual services in particular, and they've been doing a great job in North Carolina. That's me.
Excellent. Rodrigo.
And good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today, not only with my colleagues, but everyone who's joining us from across the U.S. and who even knows, maybe even around the world. My name is Rodrigo Garcia. I'm the Chief Investment Officer for B2Win 360 Capital, as well as an investor on my own in my own personal capacity. I've been in financial services now for 20 plus years, and mostly on the side of investment stewardship or investment management. In terms of my background, so I'm Mexicano, and even though I had many years in Chicago, I'm currently now based out of Miami, Florida. In terms of the boards that I sit on a couple boards on the private side. I'm a recent new addition to Canela Media, which is a great media and entertainment company that I'm happy to talk about later. And then also a board member to Framework IT, which is based out of Chicago. I do some other stuff. I do chair the investment committee for an endowment, sit on the investment committee for a couple other foundations, as well as teach finance at Northwestern University. That's me in a gist, and look forward to this great conversation.
Great. Thank you, Rodrigo. So what I love about our panel is that I think we have a really great cross-section. Both folks, Rachel, myself, having come from the operating experience, Lister coming from the technical side of things, and ultimately all of you also being on the investing side. So, and I mention all these things because we've got a number of audience members. We have people who are interested in learning about how to access board opportunities in the startup world. We have founders who are thinking very much about, as I add board members, what experiences perhaps should I be looking for? And I want to get to all of those different areas. But let's start with, I think, the heart of this, because I think people who are in this space, I get very excited. It's like a passion. Like, you love startups, you love the environment, you love founders. I mean, there's an energy around this. So talk to me a little bit. Let's start with Rodrigo. How did you ultimately get involved with startups? And from there, ultimately, how did you decide that sitting on a board was something that you wanted to do? And ultimately, how did you find those opportunities?
Yeah, most definitely. So I would say it's a combination, and it's going to be dependent on a number of different factors. But I would tell you that in terms of my interest in serving on boards, it's always been an extension of your experience and skill sets that you provide. Most people look at boards as, they want to be able to have the prestige or the pay or some other aspect, but I really feel that it's an extension of leadership, of governance, of strategy, and many of the skill sets, functional or experience, that you may be able to bring to the table as an extension into the boardroom and being able to apply it in a different way. Now, in terms of how do you find a number of these opportunities, I would say that a lot, I think it usually comes in three different flavors. Flavor number one is you come at it from a perspective of the company. Usually a founder, a co-founder, or the current CEO is looking to add to the board to represent he or her interest. The second flavor is in the form of an investor. Usually investors who invest in a number of startup companies receive representation in the boardroom to be able to provide insight and perspective from those stakeholders, even though not exclusively. And then the third flavor is this notion of the independent board directors, which usually is a combination and supposed to provide balance in the boardroom. And those are usually found through any number of sources, which I'm pretty sure we can discuss here as part of the conversation. But that's how I have gone about it. And that is how I have at least been connected thus far to date.
Lister, how about you? How'd you decide to make the jump from a technologist to an investor? And ultimately, really, you're tremendously busy. So how do you make the time for board service? Tell us a little bit about kind of your passion for it, and certainly, obviously, how you've ventured into sitting on some of the boards that you invest in.
So I became an investor because I was interested in entrepreneurship, and having been born in South America with a father who was an engineer, came to the U.S. and became an engineer. I didn't realize that my father, engineer, was an entrepreneur. When I started working here at a big company, I felt much more, I felt insignificant, really, being part of a big company. So I felt this need to go and explore a different aspect, and went to business school. And in business school is when I discovered venture capital. So I jumped into funding this fund in a way. So I'm an entrepreneur whose startup happens to be a venture capital fund. That's how I would describe myself. And in terms of boards, I didn't seek out to sit on boards. I learned that part of the investment process required me to sit on boards. Mm-hmm. I've sat on, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 boards over several years. And in all of those cases, it has been a requirement. It's part of my job. Mm-hmm. So it's really part of what I do on a day-to-day basis. I actually think about board and board representation, or really more about helping companies grow as 1/3 of the work that I do, and really ultimately get compensated on. I think about it as helping the company, of course, but I know that if the companies are going to be helped, that is going to help the organization for which I work.
Great. And Rachel, I'm going to jump to you because your journey and mine, you and I have spoken, we've had similar journeys in terms of beginning our careers as operating executives. I think both of us got very involved more out of heart and realizing, wow, we have all these skills. How can we utilize it and really help young founders who may not have kind of the access to expertise. And so I think both of us have experience having volunteered for accelerators, right? And I do want to talk about that because oftentimes people ask, how do I journey to a board?
Yeah.
And sometimes those opportunities are not necessarily going to be paid up front, you know. Sometimes volunteering your time, understanding the ecosystem, getting involved with founders is actually the best way to kind of be asked to either sit on a board, or I definitely want to talk, Rachel, because I know you have experience with this, if you want to touch on this too in your answer. You know, sometimes it's sitting not necessarily as an independent board member, but in an advisory board capacity. So Rachel, would love to hear, obviously, your journey. Ultimately, I know you're an entrepreneur as well, so that was kind of the bug. But when it comes to boards and your involvement in giving back, I love what Rodrigo said. Of course, many people look at this as a financial opportunity, but I think especially for those of us who are involved in the startup world and are committed to seeing underrepresented founders make their mark, there's also passion in this in terms of giving our time. So talk a little bit about your journey as both advisor and board member, and ultimately, you know, kind of how'd you catch the bug?
Yeah, so I think I'm a combination of a lot of the things that people have said. I like Lister, you know, my dad's an entrepreneur in Costa Rica and grew up very entrepreneurial, but also I think I've kind of done every flavor of board member. So I sat in my own board with my company Scentbird, and so had the experience of being on the founder side of sitting on a board and the challenges and the hard conversations that come here. I've also been an independent board member, investing and advising. And I think that the you know, whatever board, whatever flavor of board member you are, I think it's really important to think about your motivation. Because what I've realized as I sit on more and more boards is that different board members might have different motivations. For example, I sat in one board where there was one board member that was an older investor and was eager to see the company exit, where a more recent investor was eager to have the company grow faster and not exit so fast, right? So there are some priorities that are just based on, you know, the what they're representing. I think the point about advisory board, which is a little bit different, right? Because an advisory board might not have the same legal responsibilities, right? Because ultimately, a board in a company could get rid of the CEO, right? And that's a very humbling amount of responsibility that you have. Whereas an advisory board, you don't really have the authority to add or remove, but what you do have is the ear of the CEO. And a lot of, you know, what I think is really important is what kind of value can you add to the CEO? I think there's an extra layer of passion and responsibility when you're doing that for a diverse founder, because frankly, there are so few of us. And so my feeling is always like, what can I do to help this business succeed? I think of it as the individual business, but I also think about it as like, you know, there's a lot of conversation today about like helping Latinos make their mark in this country and how much we can add value in entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. Rachel, one of the questions that I know we're going to get from audience members is, so I think, and I'm going to come back to both Rodrigo and Lister on kind of the board member as investor, but so how do I even get started on the journey if I've never sat on a board, right? But I have these skill sets and I have the desire. How do I even get started learning a little bit about both getting prepared, understanding how to be an effective board member or advisor? Any suggestions for people in terms of just that beginning phase of getting yourself ready for this type of board service?
So I do think that accelerators are a great way to get involved, at least if you haven't done this before. A lot of accelerators truly, you know, they want to build up their mentor network. You know, I'm an advisor of Techstars, 500 Startups, ERA here in New York. the company, the accelerators are eager to add mentors and advisors, and the companies are eager to work with these mentors and advisors because it's hugely valuable. And so, particularly if you don't come from the startup world and you come more from a corporate world, you still have incredible value, right? In terms of, how do you processes and networks and B2B relationships, things like that. And so I always say that, to me, that's a great sort of on-ramp to learn about companies and help them. I think that, there's a difference between sort of a one-off mentor and having that one call and that one relationship, and that can be great. Whereas taking on an advisory role, again, it depends how formal you make it. I mean, I've had like formal advisory roles that have an advisor agreement, a vesting term, clearly laid out responsibilities. So, there's a huge range between very casual sort of, call me when you need me, or we talk once, to like a very set, more formal relationship as an advisor, as part of the advisory role board, all the way to being a board member, which is a different piece. But I think to me, that's a great way. I think a lot of people talk about non-for-profit boards as an on-ramp. And, I think it really depends. I don't know how relevant, frankly, it is for startups. I think it's perhaps more relevant for non-for-profit. For public companies that are very large, so that if you're in a very large non-for-profit board, it sort of shows your board experience, and that might be more relevant to a larger company. I think for startups, it's more of, getting to know them, getting to know the founder, proving the value that you can bring. And I think the advisory role might be a little bit more relevant. Although I don't want to discourage anyone from non-for-profit boards. I think they're amazing. But I think it depends on what your priority is.
Yeah. Well, which brings me to Rodrigo. I'm going to ask you this, and then Lister, I'd love your perspective as well, because I know both of you and this is, of course, a little bit of a plug for Angeles Investors and for funds, right? You're both very involved with the angel community. And one area that I think a lot of people, perhaps you're right, Rachel, people have kind of this operational experience or very financial experience, technical experience, but they've never really been in the startup world of understanding kind of how companies are valued, how equity works, like this, that's all like a new language. Rodrigo, can you talk a little bit about the benefit of becoming part of an angel investor community, learning and hearing how diligence is done, and kind of getting your feet wet in terms of how companies pitch themselves, project growth, are valued? Would love to hear, because I think that's another key education piece for people who, again, want to understand how to understand the ecosystem better. Becoming a small investor is a great way to do that. So, Rodrigo, I don't if you can touch on that, and then Lister, I know you obviously run a fund and many people as part of that. But I'd love to hear some of the benefits that you hear from your membership as well.
Yeah, most definitely. And thank you for that plug, because I was already getting prodded and saying, oh, you left out Angeles from your portfolio and your resume. I was like, oh, that is true. And so I do sit as the chair of the investment committee.
I'm a proud Angeles investor. I'm sorry, I should have led with that.
So we have, Angeles Investors, for those who are not aware, is an organization that is not that old, maybe about 2 years old. But in the last couple of years, we have funded a bit, somewhere between $6 and $7 million to about 16 to 18 different types of investment prospects, all of them with some tie into the Latino community. So for those of you who are members or are not members, I'm going to try to tie a number of these different things and how Angeles Investors becomes that connective tissue, which is we are exposed to any number of startups on a given basis, many who are looking for the expertise, for the experience, and yes, obviously the dollars that many members may be able to bring to the table. And so as you're looking to evaluate whether a formal fiduciary board or whether an advisory board or even a board observer may be something in the cards, Angeles investors can definitely assist as part of that process, as well as incubators, accelerators, and some of the other notions that were alluded to here before. Now, the key, though, is for those of you who may be actively contemplating those and you are actively evaluating how, whether it's a one-off, to Rachel's point, or whether it's a structured process, whether you're an independent investor or even a member of the advisory board, and you're evaluating equity, and you may be assessing, well, how do I actually assess the value of this equity? What does it mean to vest? What does it mean for the growth of this company? Does it have profitability? What is the recurring cash flows? Well, all these things are things that we help with at Angeles Investors. On an ongoing basis. I usually take all kinds of different questions, some very basic and straightforward, which I don't mind necessarily taking. Because our part of our mandate here is not just to be able to facilitate money, or in this case, investment money, into a number of different companies, but also to teach, to educate, and to connect. So to answer the last part of that question, is what exactly is it that we do here beyond invest dollars? Well, we help educate a community, whether you're members or non-members, for exactly many of you who may not be members that may be joining us here. So we educate. Then we connect. Many of our investors, which I believe we're close to 100 now, not only to our companies, but also to each other. So we can become a much more immersed community of investors, an immersed community of founders, and an immersed community of those who support the venture capital ecosystem. And then lastly, ultimately, we allow for the wealth creation among Latinos, because I don't know if you, for those of you who are professional investors, venture capital in the last 25 years continues to be the highest rate of return of any asset class. But that also means it comes with risks. And so here we want to ensure that we minimize those risks, but we also expose many of our members who are Latino to wealth creation opportunities. So as we are continuing to move forward as a society and as a country, we make sure that many of those riches and a lot of that wealth creation is also being extended to the Latino community.
Lister, do you want to talk a little bit about, obviously the community of investors and how ultimately that's a great mode of exposing oneself to the ecosystem?
Yeah, I will say that in terms of how to learn, how to be part of a board, and how to be effective, how to be useful. It took me a while to figure that out, but I think today that there's a lot of resources. I think it's very easy to find places that sort of discuss the aspects of what does it mean to be a board member, and I think it's useful to just get a little bit of education on the roles and responsibilities of board members, and really, I think a lot of people have seen a lot of board members who think that they're being helpful by telling executives what to do, and I think they start to step on the on their feet and not allow them to make decisions. So I think there's a little bit of learning that needs to happen, but that is pretty simple and pretty basic. I think at the end of the day, probably any person who has significant experience in something, especially professional experience, can probably be effective and useful at a board. The question is, what's that company and what is that experience, and making that match. When I think about the types of things that companies tend to look for in board members, oftentimes there's the company builders, people who are looking for strategy, fundraising, hiring, firing, the basics of building companies. Obviously, those are very different depending on the stage of the company. A lot of people have experience with those. Oftentimes, also that includes industry experience. If you have deep expertise in a particular sector, you're going to be in high demand by companies that are trying to enter into that sector. So, touching into that, the second category I would think of in terms of board members is door openers. A lot of companies try to build their boards to include people who can help them open doors to big customers, potential partners. So relationships can be really useful, whether these are executives that are currently in particular roles or executives that retire and have a good Rolodex that can be helpful to that company. And then, of course, there's the big brand type of board members, people who sometimes can just add value by simply lending their name to the firm. It doesn't mean that that's all that they have to do or they can do, but to be honest, sometimes reputation, it's by association, is a big deal. I'm not sure that that exactly answered your question, but that is what I
No,
think
very,
about when it comes
very,
to.
I mean, very
Go ahead.
helpful. And you went right into our next, which was really so, and I love that you answered it because I was going to also, if you don't mind, before we move on to asking everybody else this exact same question about in their experience, how does one become an effective contributor and what are the types of skill sets, right, that boards are looking for? But I'd love you to just, you mentioned it earlier, and I'd love you for the purpose of the audience to maybe extrapolate a little bit more on what's the difference between, especially in the startup world, the board member as investor and then the independent board director. Because many companies, for those who are just learning, their first board is comprised mainly of their investors. And as they grow, then you begin to see independent directors. So I don't know, Lister, if you maybe just want to talk briefly about that difference and that process. And as somebody who sits as investor, you're very involved in ultimately expanding the board and looking for skill sets. So I think if you can just talk a little bit more about that, and then I want to kind of get to Rodrigo and Rachel too.
Yeah, there is a type of board member that gets defined when you define the company, and typically when an investor that writes a big enough check invests, they can stipulate in the documents that they are going to occupy a board seat. So when you determine the bylaws of the company, you determine how is that board going to be defined. Typically, it's very common to have a high growth venture-backed company to start with a two common board members and one preferred board member. The preferred board member is the investor. Pretty typical. And you want a small board because you want a nimble and fast team to meet very frequently and to not have to be bogged down by schedules and just be very reactive. To be honest, I think the fewer the better early on because you just want to have quick conversations and just react to issues. As the company starts to grow, you start to add the independent board member. So it's always important to have common representation. That is the management team, typically the CEO and maybe another founder. And it's also important to think about the ratios. When you add an independent board member, typically you'll do that when another round comes and another preferred director gets added. So two investors and then two common board members may be added. So that is an ideal time to add an independent board member to break the potential tie that might be in votes. So you don't typically want to have an even number of board members in order to not get into a stalemate of decision making. An independent board member tends to be somebody who is independent, not a member of the management team and not an investor. So they can truly act independently. And then they are going to be typically bringing in with them either one of these categories that I mentioned: company expertise, company building expertise, or industry expertise, or a brand. But to be honest, I think when you're building a board, you don't need to align the role to the type of board seat. I think it's important to separate: am I a common board member? Am I a preferred board member? Am I a independent board member? To what value and what expertise as an individual you bring, and to try to fill the gaps, regardless of the role. I mean, investors who will do a good job in being part of boards can identify what is their role. and maybe that is help with financial expertise or help with company building, but you don't necessarily, and then you fill in the gaps with an independent director that covers areas that the other members don't. I'll be quiet for now and maybe let others
Yeah.
add to
Rodrigo,
that.
tell me a little bit, maybe if you want to chime in too, in terms of just, again, as seeing what you've seen, what are those areas that companies, especially as they're in high growth mode, are looking to round out and fill out from a perspective, from a, outsider perspective? Just would love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Yes, most definitely. And I would say the first thing for individuals who are considering is that, at least in my view, the duty of all board members, regardless of how they got onto the board, is to represent all shareholders and all stakeholders. This whole notion of duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of prudence applies to the interests of shareholders, stakeholders, consumers, employees, vendors, and the communities in which we operate and or represent. So that's the first. And then the second piece, what I would say is that serving on the startup board, for those who are looking at from a functional perspective, also at least in my view, is that you're either nurturing or managing usually what is very hyper and fast growth. You're advising the founder and the CEO, and you're contributing to the functional aspects of the business that need, your specific expertise or experience, whether it be the product or service, whether it be diversifying revenue sources or adding to the revenue sources, or even hiring talent if you're one of your key strengths is networks. Now, with that, as you're looking as to how to add value to a particular startup board, you can do it from a horizontal perspective, which is in my view is domain expertise, functional skills like finance and accounting, sales and marketing, technology and engineering, legal and compliance, and or other specialized skills. Or you can do it from a vertical perspective, which is industry and sector experience in areas such as consumer brands, financial services, manufacturing, or healthcare are usually typical ones that I've seen. It could be previous corporate board experience, especially if it's an advanced company that is looking to get acquired or looking to go into an IPO mode. Or it can even be government experience that I've seen, especially if it's a heavily regulated product or service that you're looking for ties into government. Or even nowadays, you see much more specialized trends in areas like cybersecurity or ESG or transformation and innovation backgrounds are also high in demand. Now, with all that said, and probably to my last comment that I would say is that if you also want to be a board member, it's not just about the technical skills that you're bringing. It's the intellectual acuity. It is the emotional intelligence. It is your integrity. Someone who's going to come to the boardroom and be a coach and a mentor, who's going to possess deductive reasoning to ask the right questions and not get into the minutia and the day-to-day management. Someone who's going to be honest, but yet transparent and steadfast. So in summary, it's about people who can bring, maybe capital or relationships to the table, but also the emotional fortitude that helps founders and CEOs navigate their way into what is often in turbulent waters early on and through their growth phase of their journeys.
Rachel, I love this segue. You mentioned fiduciary and really the responsibility. Again, it's fun to sit on boards. Of course, that's part of the joy, but it's a responsibility, right? And startups are almost by definition high growth, but that also means high risk at times. So talk to us a little bit about, as a sitting board member, the unique, what makes these boards unique, what makes them challenging, and how do you manage responsibly, right? High growth, fast growth of an organization. Oftentimes you're dealing with founders who are new to management, let's say. So talk to us a little bit about your experiences with that, and just like your perspectives as a sitting board member about those responsibilities.
Thanks. So it's interesting because I was listening to Rodrigo and Lister, and I think, they did a great job across describing, there's sort of the functional value add that you can bring. There's the industry value add that you can bring. there's sort of who you are and what that brings to the table. But I also think, what I've seen it with my own experience is your life experience, and particularly if you have been a founder and now you're sitting on somebody else's board, the tough decisions that had to be made. Investors will have a different perspective, right? And a VC might be telling you raise because that's what they're in the business of deploying capital, right? Whereas I might have a perspective of, well, you might want to grow a little slower and retain more of your business because I've looked at it as a founder. So, it's really interesting because I think you have to have a little bit of humility and a little bit of, what Rodrigo was saying about there's sort of that intellectual acumen that understanding your role and your role as you manage the relationship with the CEO, because different board members represent different constituencies. That's exactly why they're there. But if you're the independent board member, you might want to also help the founder think through their own constituency, but you're also there representing the shareholders. So there's sort of like a lot of facets to it. And I think the piece about transparency and sort of, look, I'm looking at it this way because I experienced X, Y, and Z, or because I'm looking at it from this perspective is very important when you're playing a board role. And I do think that, particularly in early stage startups, there's always that conversation of, do you grow faster or do you preserve cash? Do you pursue a new market, which might be a quick hit, or do you perfect your product and really overserve your current customers? Like, there's all these, challenging questions that might not have an obvious right or wrong answer in the short term, but they will have very much long-term implications.
Can I jump in on this point?
Sure.
In fact, just to emphasize what Rachel said, which she's completely right, there are moments in time where you are in complete conflict. So as an investor, I'm a professional who is trying to maximize their returns. But as a board member, I have a fiduciary responsibility. So oftentimes I think a lot of people think about this is you're wearing one hat or the other. I think when you are sitting on the board, you really have to put on your director hat. Even if you're an investor that thinks that this is not the best thing for the fund, for the investment. And it's really important because oftentimes these two things come into conflict. Mm-hmm. And that's the issue that comes to play. And this doesn't only happen to investors, it happens to independent board members who are friends, or independent board members who maybe get a little bit of equity and may benefit one way if something happens in one direction versus what they may think. So the biggest challenge of being a board member, I think, is to manage that conflict in a way that is fair and provides for that fiduciary responsibility that is important.
Rodrigo, anything to add on that front?
Good to go.
Rachel, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, I was going to say that I do think that Lister's point about, the sort of angles of, besides sort of the work that you do at the board level during the board meetings, there's sort of the offline conversations that you're going to be having. And those are also very important, right? You might be having one-on-ones with the CEO or with the key investor that might be deciding whether they put in more money or not, right? And so it's interesting because it's like 3D chess, right? It's the best way I can describe it. There are a lot of pieces that you have to decide. And I think that, what makes board work so interesting, but also so challenging, is that you are making decisions on probably the most impactful decisions that a company needs to make. Like, that's why they're being brought up to the board.
Mm-hmm. That you bring in something really interesting, which is actually the more practical side of sitting on startup boards. And I'd love each of you to give me your thoughts. Often people think of board service as a journey that's linear, and somehow the nirvana is getting to sit on a public board company. And perhaps a little bit of it has to do with compensation, right? Which are often a component of cash and equity. much more structure, right? You know how many meetings you have a year. But I'm curious, talk to us a little bit about the specifics of, one, your time commitment. I don't know how you do 6 boards, Lister. The structure of the boards that you're on. Do you see committees like we would in other types of boards? And talk a little bit about compensation, because, I find that people often overlook private companies and startups as they think about board service, when oftentimes I think from a growth potential, that's if you get in at a great company and they do great, there's tremendous potential for growth. So talk to me a little bit about the nitty-gritty of your time commitment, the committees. How does it work? How do you get comped? I'm sure people are curious.
Are you asking me, Bernie?
Any of you, go for it, Lister.
I can
You're
start.
you're unmuted.
I can start. I think the diversity of boards and board experiences is as big as the diversity of companies. I think there's a lot of similarities between running large companies and sitting on large boards in some ways, and running small companies and sitting on small boards. I think of it a little bit like a ship that you have to navigate, and you have to help maybe the navigator. Well, I mean, it's going to be bumpy in a small ship, but it's going to be probably more exhilarating. It's going to be faster moving. You got to be more aware, more awake. You're going to be more impactful. I think in a big board, you probably have a large group of people. A transatlantic is not going to move very fast. You're not doing big changes in direction. You're overseeing, making sure that things continue to operate the way that they've been operating, hopefully. And it's rare probably that you're making big strategic shifts. So there's a lot of the nature of those boards, and the nature of the small boards, it's just as diverse, because there's a lot of in between, diverse as the diversity of companies. I'll touch a little bit on compensation, and also another thing on something important, which is directors and officers insurance, which is, I think, a key piece, very important. Every time you go on a board, you want to make sure that you have enough and sufficient and good D&O insurance. But in terms of compensation, direct investors typically, at least venture investors, don't get compensated, and probably not a good idea to compensate, because the nature of their investment hopefully is going to outweigh any additional compensation that they might provide. Angel investors, however, because they're maybe writing a smaller checks, oftentimes do get compensated. The compensation is not huge in small companies, but it can be significant if it's equity and that company really makes it big. And I'll let others chime in.
All right. I would definitely agree with many of Lister's comments. For me, I think there's a sincerely gratifying experience to be able to serve on the board of a growing company, to be able to nurture, shape, support its trajectory. It's a very special experience. With that said, as you're looking at board service, the primary purpose of a board is to support, facilitate, and foster the company's strategic priorities in consultation with the founder and/or the CEO. In other words, the founder and CEO runs the day-to-day operations of the company, and then the board of directors provides for the overall direction of the company, including items like the governance, strategic planning, approving or rejecting major business decisions, capital allocation, other functional duties like budget, approving the budget, the audit, and compensating senior leadership. Now, why do I say that? Is to give you a flavor of the time commitment that you're going to spend. And I think to Lister's earlier point, it is very much a function of where the company is in terms of its stage, as well as in terms of its growth. And so I've seen where you can spend maybe a couple of days per quarter, and I've seen it where it's usually 2 to 3 days per month, and that is usually because the company is growing significantly rapid, both either in terms of its revenue, in terms of its talent base, or it could be that it's undergoing some type of acquisition that requires additional time commitment from some of the more board members. But on average, I usually say it's usually 1 day or 1.75 to 1 day per month on average, whether it's in meetings or it could just be on emails or studying a number of different things in order to be ready for a phone call or to respond to a particular email. It's not always just sheer meetings per se. And then lastly, in terms of as you're looking at compensation, I would just add that as you're, both startups and privates, span the gamut, but usually, the thing that you should be mindful for is what is the time commitment that you're providing, what is your experience and skill set that you're facilitating to the company, and what is that worth? Perhaps you're willing to bypass cash or equity for the experience. Maybe you're not willing to do that, depending on the time and the commitment that is needed. So it's all a balance of what you're looking for across the board, at least in my view.
The only thing I would add to that, the one thing I would add to that, that I think in this virtual Zoom world that we live in is it's right now, most board meetings are happening virtually, and that significantly cuts back on the amount of time that you can dedicate. Lister, if you had to be on planes for 8 board meetings, I don't know how you do it, but on Zoom, it's a lot more doable. And so I do see a lot of, even the companies that I sit in, they're still eager to have in-person meetings. And I do think that to work well as a board, getting to know each other, getting to build that personal relationship is important. I think my guess is the world is going to end up somewhere where it'll be a hybrid, which maybe once or twice a year the board meets in person, the rest of the time it'll be remote. But I think that has a huge impact, as you're thinking of, doing board service and how much time you allocate to it, pay attention to how much of it will be in person versus remote, because it gets really challenging if you have to be on planes, trains, and automobiles.
Completely agree. Well, I'm going to go now to some audience questions. We have a little time for a couple. Besides the strong desire to be a successful investor and board member, what are the top 3 skills and a typical profile of a board member as investor? So for those of you who sit on boards as investors, what would you say the top 3 skills are that are of value?
I can come up with one. Really, really, really important. And maybe that's also number 2 or number 3. I think the most important thing that a board member can do is to not try to be a CEO, and to know when to just simply get out of the way. A board member is not there to determine the direction of the company. That's the role of the team, the management team, the executive team. Board member can fire, or a board can fire the CEO. You have the power to change the team, to change the structure. Not one person, but the entire board. And so you're there to determine who is in charge, but you're not there to make the decisions. You're there to advise. You're there to provide an opinion. It's also important, perhaps part of that number 1, to how you communicate the message of your advice. If you can think about an entrepreneur who is starting to build a company, who is, in the insecurity, and a first-time entrepreneur can be significant because, there's so many people depending on that person. Jobs are at stake, the success of the company, the investors. And it can be very impactful when an investor is not allowing that individual to make a decision, or pretending that the board member is the one really that is significantly impacting that decision making, versus presenting help and advice and then allowing that CEO to truly make the decision. So I don't know, maybe there's 2 or 3 in that category, but I think to me they point to the same issue, which is board members are there to advise. They're not there to make decisions, and they need to get out of the way and let the management team manage.
That's fantastic. I'm going to just jump to the next question because I do want to make sure that we get to the rest of these. Do you recommend using our network to help get to startup accelerator boards, or should we volunteer and try to network once we're in? So back to this question of, if I'm going to use my skill sets to get on to an accelerator as a mentor, do I let people know up front I'm interested, or is it more let me get in there? So just any of you, I don't know if Rachel, you want to comment on it.
So I guess I'll comment from the perspective as an entrepreneur and a founder. It can be really off-putting if the first time you have a conversation with the founder, they're asking you how much, can I be an advisor and can I get equity and what am I getting for this? You have to tread lightly is what I would say. Obviously your time is valuable. Obviously your skills are valuable, but you have to understand the perspective of the founder and the entrepreneur. And particularly if it's a successful company, they'll have lots of people wanting to offer help in exchange for equity. And so my advice would be, give first, provide value first, give something that they need, that they want, and then have the conversation of, hey, I'd love to continue being more involved, but for that, I'd want to have an advisory role and blah, blah, blah. But I would say tread lightly. I think it's just very, very off-putting as an entrepreneur to have somebody be like, first conversation, what are you doing for me?
Yeah. So I'm just going to do the last question before our time is up, and quick answers. But Rodrigo, Lister, this one goes to you. For those who are interested in building experience as investors, is there an opportunity to volunteer on investment committees or diligence committees of Angeles Investors, your fund? So talk to us a little bit about when investors raise their hands and say, hey, I know about this industry. I'd love to volunteer and be a part of either diligence or the investment committee or assist. So talk a little bit about what those opportunities are, if they exist.
Most definitely. The short answer is yes. To my earlier comments, we are here to educate and train. So for those individuals who are interested, please feel free to contact the team at Angeles, and they'll route the request through me or to me, and we'll make sure that we follow up and leverage your time and your commitment to make you an even better investor, and at the same time, reduce the amount of work that either the committee does or the investment staff does on our behalf.
And I think, being an angel investor is a great way to get close to companies, but also being somebody who helps, who has expertise, who offers that expertise to venture funds, to do due diligence, to dig in, to help with the company as issues come up. That's a great way, because as you pointed out, investors have way too many things going on, too many balls up in the air. And that getting somebody with expertise with help can be very useful. And oftentimes that's how the proximity brings in board members, because that proximity becomes evident, and that expertise becomes evident.
Thank you. Well, listen, we're up on time. We could have had another hour, I think. So this was a speed round version, but I so appreciate Rodrigo, Lister, Rachel. You guys are phenomenal. Your advice is invaluable. We really thank you for your time tonight. And I think with that, I'm going to throw it to Jorge and wish everybody a wonderful evening.
All right. Thank you so much, Bernadette. You're an excellent host, and I think we're privileged here at Angeles Investors to have you on the board. Thank you to the panel, Rodrigo, Rachel, and Lister. This was a great conversation, and most importantly, thank you to the audience for the great questions. We at Angeles Investor, we had a great year last year. We can have even a stronger year here in 2022. As you can see from this list of calendar events that we have, we're going big. We're taking our pitch nights on the road in a hybrid format, starting with our Q1 pitch night in Miami, Florida, February 17th and 18th. And that pitch night is being sponsored by the Mom Project. Q2, we're going to be in Silicon Valley. Q3, Chicago. We're going to finish the year strong in New York. We're also expanding our speaker series. So we'll have more charlas for you coming up. In Miami, we're going to have a charla on cryptos and NFTs from a Latinx perspective. In March, we're going to host a charla on the power of diverse annual groups. We're going to be joined by Commune Annuals, Gaingels, and Vitalize VC. And we're launching a new series called the Wealth Creation Series in partnership with the Alumni Society. And one more that's not shown on here, we have our own internal chats called La Mesa, members only, where we highlight different members of the Angeles community. The next one's going to be with Ivana Estrada of Google. And we're going to continue to come to cities near you to engage you where you are. So in February, we'll be in Dallas. March, we'll be at South by Southwest. And in April, we'll be in Washington, D.C. So you can expect us to keep showing up. So if you're looking at these kind of events, anything that interests you, you want to learn more, you want to join one of these events, feel free to reach out to us at members@analystinvestors.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Hopefully, potentially, you becoming a member of our community of accredited investors. But with that, thank you all. Close the event. And as always, to the future.